The cellar was invisible. That was the thing that bothered Jarl Knut Silvermane most. He had ridden past Ylva Thorvaldsdottir's farm 6 times since her husband drowned, and each time he had noted the same things. No smokehouse, no drying racks, no barrels of salted cod stacked against the cabin wall, no visible food stores of any kind. A woman with no food stores in September was a woman who would not see April. That was not cruelty. That was mathematics. And Knut Silvermane had built his holdings on mathematics, on the precise calculation of who would survive and who would fail, and on being ready to acquire what the failures left behind. "She has nothing," he told his steward, Halvor, as they rode back from inspecting the farms along the Hardanger fjord. No fish drying, no grain visible, no meat hanging. And the woman is either eating everything as she catches it, which means she will starve by January, or she has given up entirely. "She fishes every day," Halvor offered. "I have seen her on the rocks at dawn. She catches more than most men." Catching fish is not the same as keeping fish. Where are the drying racks? Where is the smokehouse? Where is the evidence that she is preserving anything for the winter? Halvor had no answer. The evidence was not there because Ylva had deliberately removed it. She had taken down the drying racks in July. She had dismantled the smokehouse in August. She had made her farm look exactly like what Knut expected to see. A widow's farm in decline, a property slowly failing, a piece of land that would be available for acquisition by spring. What Knut could not see was underground, 4 feet below the surface of Ylva's back field, in a cellar that she had dug the summer her husband Torbjorn was still alive. 500 pounds of smoked fish lay in sealed birch bark containers, packed in layers of dried moss and wood ash, resting in the constant cold of the earth below the frost line. Torbjorn had helped her dig the cellar. He had not understood why she wanted it. They had a perfectly good smokehouse, a set of sturdy drying racks, and a salt supply that was adequate for their needs. But Ylva had insisted, and Torbjorn had learned in 9 years of marriage that when Ylva insisted on something with that particular tone in her voice, the tone that was quiet and firm and carried the weight of certainty, the wisest course was to pick up a shovel and start digging. "My mother told me about the long winters," Ylva had said, standing at the edge of the field with a stick, marking the outline of the cellar in the dirt. "The winters that last 8 months, 9 months. The winters where the stores run out, and the fjord stays frozen, and the fish do not come back until June. Those winters are rare," Torbjorn had said. "Rare is not never. Rare is the thing that kills you because you did not prepare for it." Torbjorn had looked at his wife, this strong, practical woman who had come to his farm from the northern coast, from a family of fishermen who had survived generations of Arctic winters. And he had recognized the particular expression she wore when she was thinking about something that frightened her. Not the immediate fear of a storm or a wolf or a difficult birth. The deeper fear of a systemic failure, of a winter so long that all the normal preparations proved insufficient. He had picked up the shovel. Together, they had dug a cellar 8 feet long, 6 feet wide, and 4 feet deep. Ylva had lined the walls with flat stones carried from the shore, fitting them tight, creating a barrier between the earth and the stored food. She had laid the floor with gravel for drainage, then flat stones on top, then a layer of dried moss that would absorb any moisture that seeped through. The ceiling was driftwood beams covered with birch bark, then a layer of clay, then turf, then the original topsoil replaced on top so that the cellar was invisible from above. The entrance was a wooden hatch set into the ground behind the cowshed, covered with a layer of turf that matched the surrounding field. You could stand on the hatch and not know it was there. You could walk past it 100 times and see nothing but grass. If you have been watching Saga of Survival for a while, you know that the best preparations are the ones nobody sees. Ulva understood this instinctively. A smokehouse full of fish was an invitation. It told every neighbor, every traveler, every passing trader exactly how much food you had. A cellar full of fish was invisible. It told no one anything. Torbjorn had drowned the following March. His fishing boat had capsized in a spring squall on the outer fjord, the kind of sudden, violent storm that takes experienced sailors as easily as novices. They found the boat washed up on the rocks near Steinvik. They never found Torbjorn. Ylva had mourned him privately, in the way of her people, silently, completely, without display. She had stood at the edge of the fjord on the morning they told her and looked at the water that had taken her husband, and she had felt the particular grief of a woman who has lost the person who understood her, who dug cellars without asking why, who trusted her judgment without requiring proof. Then she had gone home and started filling the cellar. The process had begun the previous autumn, when Torbjorn was still alive. Ylva had smoked fish using a method her mother had taught her. A slow, cold smoke, not the hot smoke that most families used. The difference was critical. Hot smoked fish tasted better and preserved adequately, lasting 3 to 4 months in a cool environment. Cold smoked fish was harder, drier, less palatable, but it lasted almost indefinitely if stored properly. The slow smoke drove out nearly all the moisture, leaving a dense, leather-like product that was more concentrated nutrition per pound than any other preserved food. She had smoked 60 pounds that first autumn, packed it in birch bark containers lined with dried moss and sealed with pine pitch, and buried it in the cellar. Torbjorn had tasted one piece and made a face. "It tastes like a boot," he said. "Boots do not keep you alive in April. This will." He had shrugged and gone back to his work. The 60 pounds sat in the cellar through the winter, untouched, unnecessary, because that winter was normal. 5 months of cold, a March thaw, fish in the fjord by April. The smokehouse provided what they needed. The cellar was insurance against a disaster that did not arrive. The following summer, after Torbjorn's death, Ylva had increased production. She fished every morning, dawn to mid-morning, pulling cod and haddock from the fjord with a methodical efficiency that impressed even the professional fishermen who watched her from their boats. She cleaned each fish on the rocks, gutted it, split it down the spine, and carried it home to the cold smoke frame she had built behind the cowshed. A simple structure of willow branches and burlap, fed by a smoldering fire of green alder chips that produced the low, cool smoke she needed. Each batch took 4 days. The fish hung in the smoke frame, absorbing the antimicrobial compounds in the alder smoke, losing moisture slowly, shrinking and hardening until they were reduced to roughly 1/3 of their original weight. When they were done, when the flesh was firm enough to resist a thumbnail pressed into the surface, Ylva packed them in birch bark containers and carried them to the cellar. The birch bark containers were her own design, adapted from a technique her mother had used for storing dried berries and seal fat on the northern coast. She cut the bark in large sheets from birch trees in the forest above the farm, soaked the sheets in the creek until they were pliable, then shaped them around a wooden form, a cylinder roughly 10 inches in diameter and 14 inches tall. She stitched the seam with sinew, applied a layer of pine pitch inside and out to make the container waterproof, and fitted a lid cut from the same bark, sealed with more pitch. Each container held 12 to 14 pounds of cold-smoked fish when packed tight. The dried moss between the layers served 3 purposes. It absorbed any residual moisture from the fish. It provided a physical barrier between layers that prevented them from fusing together during storage, and it added a faint antimicrobial effect of its own because the particular moss that grew along the creek bank contained compounds that inhibited bacterial growth. The wood ash served a 4th purpose. Ylva sprinkled a thin layer of ash between the containers in the cellar, covering the floor and filling the gaps between the rows. The ash discouraged insects. Beetles and larvae would not cross a bed of wood ash because the fine alkaline particles damaged their exoskeletons and dried out their bodies. A cellar without ash was a cellar that would eventually be found by the grain beetles and the fish moths that infested every above-ground storage building in the settlement. A cellar with ash was a cellar that remained pristine. Her mother had taught her all of this, not in a single lesson, but across years of observation, years of working side by side in the fish camps of the northern coast, years of listening to a woman who treated food preservation the way a shipwright treated hull construction, as a discipline with precise specifications where every detail mattered and no shortcut was acceptable. The settlement watched Ylva fish and wondered what she was doing with the catch. They saw her on the rocks every morning. They saw the fish she carried home. But they did not see the smoke frame behind the cowshed, because the cowshed blocked the view from the main path, and they did not smell the cold smoke, because cold smoke is thin and nearly odorless, nothing like the thick, pungent clouds that rose from the hot smoke houses. They saw a widow who fished and assumed she was eating what she caught. They did not see a woman building an underground reserve against a disaster that none of them believed would come. Ylva kept careful records. She marked each container with a notch on the rim. 1 notch for June, 2 for July, 3 for August, 4 for September. She counted the containers each time she descended into the cellar, noting the total on a tally stick she kept inside the hatch frame. By midsummer, the count was 28. By August, 35. By September, 42. 500 pounds. She had calculated this number based on her mother's formula. 1 pound of cold smoked fish per person per day provides approximately 1,500 calories and 40 grams of protein, enough to sustain an adult through moderate activity. 50 people for 10 days required 500 pounds. 100 people for 5 days required 500 pounds. Ylva did not know how many people would need feeding, or for how long. But she knew that 500 pounds was a meaningful amount, enough to bridge a gap, enough to prevent the worst outcomes, enough to matter. Now, before we go further, if you have been watching Saga of Survival and these stories speak to you, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. It takes a second and it is free. And it is, stay with me, because what Ylva buried beneath her back field is the reason 43 people survived what comes next. By September, the cellar held 500 pounds of cold-smoked fish in 42 birch bark containers, arranged in rows on the stone floor, each container sealed and labeled with a notch system that told Ylva the date it was packed. The oldest fish was 11 months old. The newest was 2 weeks old. Every container was sound. She tested one of the oldest containers on the 1st of September, prying open the pitch seal and examining the fish inside. The flesh was dark amber, hard, dry, with no sign of mold, no smell of rot, no evidence of insect damage. The dried moss packing had absorbed any residual moisture. The wood ash layered between the containers had discouraged the few insects that might have found their way into the cellar. The temperature, a constant 42 degrees year-round below the frost line, had slowed any bacterial activity to near zero. The fish was perfect, 11 months underground, and it was indistinguishable from the fish she had packed 2 weeks ago, except for a slightly deeper color and a slightly more concentrated flavor. Ylva had dismantled the drying racks and the smokehouse the following week. She had done this deliberately, with calculation, to create the appearance of a woman who had given up. The racks came down. The smokehouse was taken apart, the wood stacked neatly against the barn wall as if it would be used for firewood. The farm looked bare. It looked finished. It looked like exactly what Jarl Knut expected to see when he rode past, counting his future acquisitions. The winter came early that year. The first snow fell in the last week of September, a full month ahead of schedule, and by mid-October, the fjord was beginning to ice over. This was not the gradual, predictable freeze of a normal winter. This was sudden and aggressive, the cold arriving like an invasion, pushing the temperature down and keeping it down with a relentlessness that made the old people shake their heads and say they had never seen anything like it. By November, the fjord was frozen solid. The fishing season was over. The boats were hauled up, and the stores that every family had calculated based on a normal winter, a 5-month winter, with a March thaw and April fishing, were suddenly the only food that would exist until the ice broke. If the ice broke in March, the stores would be enough. If it broke in April, they would be tight. If it broke in May or later, people would starve. The ice did not break in March. It did not break in April. It did not break in May. The 8-month winter had arrived. The thing that Ylva's mother had warned her about, the rare event, the thing that kills you because you did not prepare for it. By January, the conversations in Havenfjord had shifted from the casual optimism of early winter to the careful calculations of people who are beginning to realize that their preparations are insufficient. Families counted their stores. They measured their grain. They weighed their dried fish. They did the mathematics. And the mathematics told them what Ylva had known since September. There was not enough. Knut Silvermane's storehouse was well supplied, as always. He had more than most, and he sold the surplus at the prices that scarcity allowed. High prices, winter prices, the prices that transferred land and labor from the desperate to the prepared. 2 families had already traded fishing rights for grain. 1 family had signed over 6 acres of cleared land for 3 months of food. Ylva watched from her farm and said nothing. She did not visit the storehouse. She did not buy grain. She did not trade land or labor or rights. She ate from her cellar, 1 container at a time, rationing the fish with the methodical precision of a woman who had calculated exactly how long her stores would last and how many people they could feed. The first knock on her door came in February. It was Gunnar, the farmer from the adjacent land, a man who had watched Ylva dismantle her smokehouse with the bemused satisfaction of someone who was certain that the widow next door was finished. He stood in her doorway with his wife and 3 children behind him, all of them thin, all of them wearing the particular expression of people who have come to ask for something they would rather die than ask for. His wife, Inga, held the youngest on her hip, a boy of 4 whose face was sharp with hunger and whose eyes were too large for his head. The older children, a girl of 8 and a boy of 10, stood behind their parents with the careful stillness of children who have learned that being quiet and small is the safest way to exist when the adults are frightened. "Ylva," he said, "we have nothing left." Ylva looked at him. She looked at the way his belt was cinched 3 holes tighter than it should have been. She looked at his hands, rough and cracked, the hands of a man who had been chopping firewood in the cold without gloves because the gloves had worn through and there was no leather to replace them. She looked at Inga's face, which was gray with the particular exhaustion of a woman who has been feeding her children from her own plate for weeks, giving them her portion, telling them she had already eaten, lying with the practiced ease of a mother who would rather starve than watch her children starve. "Come with me," she said. She led them around the cowshed to the back wall, where the hay bales were stacked against the timber. She moved 3 bales aside. They were lighter than they should have been, because the livestock feed was running low too, and revealed the turf-covered hatch set into the ground. It was invisible, even from 3 feet away. The turf matched the surrounding ground perfectly. The hinges were set below the surface. The handle was a loop of rope buried under a clump of grass. Gunnar stared at the dark opening in the ground. He had walked past this spot 1,000 times. He had looked at this ground 1,000 times. He had seen grass and dirt and nothing else, because there was nothing else to see. "What is this?" he asked. "My cellar." "You do not have a cellar." "I have had a cellar since before Torbjorn died. You did not know because it was not designed to be known." She lifted the hatch. A rush of cool, dry air rose from the opening, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of cold smoked fish. Rich, amber, concentrated, the smell of months of careful preservation sealed in the earth. A ladder of notched timber descended into the dark. Ylva went down first, lighting a tallow candle at the bottom. The flame illuminated the cellar, and Gunnar, looking down from above, saw what Ylva had been building for 18 months. Rows of birch bark containers lined the stone walls, stacked 2 high, each one sealed with pine pitch, each one marked with notches on the rim. The stone walls were dry and clean, the gravel floor visible between the container rows, the dried moss packing the gaps like insulation. The ceiling beams were solid, the birch bark overhead unmarked by moisture or mold. The temperature was cool but not cold, the constant 42 degrees of the earth below the frost line, a temperature that Ylva had maintained all year without fire, without effort, without any intervention at all. It was a warehouse, an invisible underground warehouse, 4 feet beneath the grass of a field that Gunnar had walked across at least once a week for as long as he had lived on the adjacent farm. "Come down," Ylva said. Gunnar descended the ladder. His wife followed, handing the youngest to the older children, who waited above. The cellar was large enough for both of them to stand side by side with room to move, 8 feet by 6 feet, a proper room with proper walls and a proper floor. Ylva opened a container. She pried the pitch seal with her knife, lifted the lid, and the amber scent intensified. The dense, smoky, savory fragrance of fish that had been cold smoked to leather hardness and stored in the dark for months. She lifted a piece and handed it to Gunnar. He held it. He smelled it. He turned it in his hands, feeling the density of it, the weight that was disproportionate to its size, the concentrated mass of protein and fat that had been compressed into a space 1/3 of its original volume. "How long has this been here?" he asked. The oldest is 14 months. The newest is 5 months. They are all sound. Gunnar bit into the fish. The texture was tough, the flavor intensely smoky and savory, dense with the concentrated protein of fish that had been dried to a third of its original volume. It was not pleasant in the way that fresh fish is pleasant, but it was food, real food, food that had been underground for over a year and was still safe and still nutritious and still capable of keeping a body alive. He chewed, he swallowed, he closed his eyes, and for a moment, standing in the cellar, surrounded by 36 containers of food that he had not known existed an hour ago, Gunnar felt something he had not felt since December: the absence of fear. The specific, physical absence of the fear that his children would die before spring. "How much is here?" he asked. His voice was different now. The desperation was still there, but layered on top of it was something new. Hope. The particular, fragile hope of a man who has been handed a solution he did not expect. "Enough for your family for 2 months. Enough for the settlement for 3 weeks. I have calculated it. You have calculated it. I have calculated everything. The number of people, the number of days, the number of calories per pound, the soaking ratio, the cooking method, the rationing schedule, and everything." Gunnar looked at his neighbor. This quiet, methodical woman who had been dismissed as a failing widow by every person in the settlement, including him. This woman who had buried 500 pounds of food in a field that nobody looked at, in a cellar that nobody knew existed, using a technique that nobody practiced against a disaster that nobody believed would come. "Tell no one yet," Ylva said. "When the time is right, I will open the cellar to the settlement, but not yet, not until they need it badly enough to listen. They need it now. They need it in a month. Right now they are worried. In a month they will be desperate. Desperate people follow instructions. Worried people argue." Gunnar took 3 pounds of fish for his family and climbed the ladder back to the light. He did not tell anyone. He kept Ylva's secret for 4 weeks, feeding his children from the cellar supply, watching them regain the color in their cheeks, watching the fear leave their eyes, knowing that the same thing could happen for every family in the settlement if Ylva decided to open her cellar. She opened it in early March, when the stores across the settlement were truly gone, and the desperation that she had predicted had arrived. If Saga of Survival has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. Your support helps us bring you more stories of Norse ingenuity and quiet vindication. By March, Ylva was feeding 11 families from the cellar. She opened the containers carefully, one at a time, distributing the fish in measured portions, showing the women how to soak the hard, dried flesh in water for an hour before cooking to soften it and expand it, how to boil the soaking water into a broth that contained nearly as much nutrition as the fish itself, how to stretch each pound across more meals by mixing it with whatever grain or root vegetables remained. The discipline was strict. Ylva measured every portion with a wooden scale her husband had made, balancing the dried fish against a set of stones of known weight. Each person received 8 ounces per day, half a pound of concentrated fish that, when soaked and cooked, expanded to roughly 1.5 pounds of edible food. It was not enough to feel full. It was enough to stay alive and functional. She taught them the hierarchy of consumption: children and nursing mothers first, at full rations; working men second, at 3/4 rations; everyone else at half rations. This was not cruelty, it was triage. The children needed the calories for growth. The nursing mothers needed them for milk. The working men needed them to haul water and clear snow and maintain the structures that kept everyone else alive. The rest could survive on less because the rest were not growing or producing or performing heavy labor. The mathematics were tight. 36 containers, 11 families, roughly 100 people. At the rationing schedule Ulva had established, the stores would last until early May. If the ice broke before then, they would survive. If it did not, they would not. April was the hardest month. The psychological weight of a winter that would not end pressed down on the settlement like a physical force. People who had been patient in January were angry in April. People who had been cooperative in February were suspicious in March and hostile by the first week of April. The rationing, which had been accepted as necessary during the darkest months, was now questioned, challenged, resented. Why did the children get more? Why did the working men get more? Why was Ylva, a woman, a widow, making the decisions about who ate how much? Ylva handled the complaints the same way she handled everything, with calculation. She showed the challengers the numbers. She showed them the containers. She showed them the tally stick with its daily notches, each one representing a day of feeding and a container of fish consumed. She showed them the mathematics of survival, the simple, undeniable arithmetic that said this many people eating this much food would exhaust the supply on this date, and changing the rationing would move that date forward, closer to starvation, closer to the end. The numbers silenced most of the complaints. Numbers are difficult to argue with. You can argue with a person. You can argue with an opinion. You cannot argue with a count of containers and a count of days and the simple division that connects them. But not everyone was silenced. Knut Silvermane's steward, Halvor, came to Ylva's farm in the second week of April with a suggestion that was not really a suggestion. Knut wanted to take control of the cellar. He wanted the containers moved to his storehouse, where he could manage the distribution himself, through his own people, under his own authority. The Jarl believes the distribution should be centralized, Halvor said, standing in Ylva's doorway, in his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man delivering a message he does not entirely agree with. The Jarl's storehouse has been empty since February, Ylva replied. The cellar is on my land, filled with my fish, preserved by my technique. The distribution stays with me. The Jarl can build his own cellar next summer. This one is mine. Halvor left. Knut did not press the matter, because pressing the matter would have required him to take food from a widow by force, and even a man as practical as Knut understood that the political cost of that action would exceed any benefit. The containers dwindled, 20 in mid-April, 15 by the third week, 10 by the end of April. Each opening was a small ceremony now. Ylva descending the ladder, selecting the container with the oldest date mark, prying the seal, inspecting the fish, carrying the portions up into the light where the women waited with their bags and their scales and their careful, measured expectations. 9 containers, then 8, then 7, then 6. If you are still here, hit that subscribe button right now. It is free, takes a second, and what happens next will change everything you think you know about food storage. 5 containers, then 4, then 3. Each day, Ylva stood at the edge of the fjord and watched the ice. Each day the ice was there, white and solid, unchanged, unmoved by the warming sun that was lengthening the days and softening the snow on the hills above the settlement. The ice was thick enough to hold, thick enough to last another week, another 2 weeks, another month. There was no way to know. 2 containers left. 24 pounds of fish. 3 days. The ice broke on the 14th of May, 8 months and 2 weeks after it had formed. The longest continuous freeze in the memory of anyone living on the Hardanger fjord. Ylva heard it first. She was standing at the edge of the fjord at dawn, as she stood every dawn, watching the ice, reading it the way her mother had taught her to read it, looking for the dark patches that meant thinning, listening for the deep groaning sounds that meant the tidal pressure was working beneath the surface. For weeks she had seen nothing. The ice was white, thick, solid, reflecting the morning light like polished stone. But on the 14th, something changed. A dark line appeared 100 yards from shore, running parallel to the coast, thin and ragged like a crack in a pane of glass. As she watched, the line widened. Water showed through. Dark, living water, the first open water she had seen since September. She watched the crack for an hour, standing motionless on the shore, and during that hour, the crack widened from a hairline to a foot, and then to a yard, and the sheets of ice on either side began to rock gently with the tide, lifting and settling, and the groaning sound grew louder, deeper, the sound of 8 months of ice giving way to the patient, relentless pressure of the sea beneath. By midday, the channel was open. By evening, the inner fjord was breaking apart, the ice fragmenting into sheets that tumbled and spun in the current, smashing against each other with sounds like distant thunder. By the following morning, the fjord was navigable. Ylva's cellar had 2 containers left, 24 pounds of fish, 3 days of food for 100 people. The margin had been that thin. 3 days between survival and starvation. 3 days between the underground fish and the end of everything. She had known the margin was thin. She had counted the containers every day for the past month, running the same calculation each morning, adjusting the rations by fractions of an ounce when the math demanded it, making cuts so small that the family she was feeding did not notice the difference. A 1/4 ounce less per person per day meant 2 extra days of supply. 2 days could be the difference. And it was. The ice broke 3 days before the cellar would have been empty. The first boats went out on the 15th. The fish were running. Thick, dense schools of cod that had been waiting beneath the ice for months, and the nets came up heavy and full, and the men who pulled them wept openly at the weight. Not from sadness, from relief, from the overwhelming physical relief of holding food in their hands after months of holding nothing, of counting nothing, of watching the cellar containers diminish one by one, and wondering whether the earth would run out before the ice broke. Knut Silvermane called a thing in late May. The hall was full. The mood changed from the grim assemblies of winter. People looked different, thinner, yes, marked by the winter, certainly. Their faces carried the lines of months of hunger, the hollowed cheeks, the prominent bones, the particular thinness that comes not from 1 week of deprivation, but from 6 months of sustained insufficient nutrition. But they were alive, all of them, every family, every child, every old person who should have died in a winter that long and that cold. All alive because a woman had buried fish in the ground and opened her cellar when the settlement needed it. Knut stood before the assembly. He was not a man given to public emotion, but the winter had changed him the way it changed everyone, stripping away the comfortable certainties of a man who had always had more than enough and replacing them with the uncomfortable knowledge that his surplus had run out 2 months before the ice broke, and the only thing that had kept his settlement alive was a widow's cellar. "The fishing rights and land deeds acquired this winter are void," he said. His steward's head snapped up. This was unprecedented. Knut had never returned an acquisition. "Every trade made under duress of starvation is cancelled. The land returns to the families who owned it. The rights return to the fishermen who held them." The hall was silent. People looked at each other. The families who had signed over their land and their fishing rights. The most desperate ones. The ones who had traded everything for a few weeks of food at Knut's winter prices, sat on the benches with expressions of confusion. They had signed documents. They had made legal transfers. The trades were binding under Norse law. For a jarl to void his own legal acquisitions was not just generous. It was an admission that the acquisitions had been wrong, that profiting from starvation was wrong, that the entire system that had made Knut wealthy was wrong. He looked at Ylva, who was sitting on the women's bench, her hands in her lap, her face showing nothing. "Ulva Thorvaldsdottir saved this settlement. She saved it with fish she buried in a hole that none of us knew existed. She saved it because her mother taught her something that none of us knew, and she had the patience to prepare for a disaster that none of us believed would come." He paused. "I will be building a cellar this summer. I suggest you all do the same." Ulva taught the settlement that summer. She held the first teaching day on the longest day of the year, when the light lasted until midnight and the air was warm and the memory of the winter was still fresh enough to motivate people to dig. She started with the cellar. She opened hers, lifted the hatch, descended the ladder, and stood at the bottom while 20 people peered down from above. She showed them the stone walls, the gravel drainage, the flat stone floor, said the moss layers. She pointed out the details that mattered, the tightness of the stone joints, the slope of the floor toward the drainage channel, the overlap of the birch bark on the ceiling, the pitch seal around the hatch frame. 4 feet below the frost line, she said. That is the rule. 4 feet below the frost line, the temperature does not change. Winter or summer, the temperature is 42 degrees. That is where your food lives. She taught them the cold smoke technique next. This was the part that required the most attention, because cold smoking was different from hot smoking in ways that were subtle but critical. Hot smoking cooked the fish while it smoked it, producing a soft, flaky product that tasted excellent and lasted 3 months. Cold smoking did not cook the fish. It dried it while infusing it with antimicrobial smoke compounds, producing a hard, dense product that tasted like leather and lasted years. The key was temperature. The smoke had to be cold, below 80 degrees, ideally around 60. This meant the fire could not be in the same chamber as the fish. Ulva showed them her setup, a fire pit dug 10 feet from the smoke frame, connected by a shallow trench covered with flat stones. The smoke traveled through the trench, cooling as it went, arriving at the smoke frame at the correct temperature. The fish hung in the frame for 4 days, turning slowly in the cool smoke, losing moisture, hardening, transforming from fresh flesh into preserved fuel. She showed them the birch bark containers. She demonstrated the cutting, the soaking, the shaping, the stitching, the pitch seal. She showed them the moss packing and the wood ash layering. She showed them how to test the seal by submerging a finished container in water. If no bubbles appeared, the seal was sound. She answered questions for 3 hours. The questions were practical, specific, the questions of people who intended to build, not people who were curious. How deep should the drainage channel be? What type of stone was best for the walls? How to prevent the hatch from warping in the freeze-thaw cycle? Whether birch bark from young trees was better than bark from old trees? Whether haddock worked as well as cod? Whether the technique worked for meat as well as fish? Ulva answered every question with the specific, the patient authority of someone who had done the thing she was teaching and done it long enough to know the answers from experience rather than theory. 14 families built cellars that summer. Ylva inspected each one, checking the depth, the stonework, the drainage, the hatch seal. She rejected 3, one too shallow, one poorly drained, one with gaps in the stone lining that would admit moisture and rodents. The families who failed dug again, corrected the problems, and passed Ylva's inspection on the second attempt. By September, the Hardanger Fjord had 14 underground cellars and 60 new birch bark containers of cold-smoked fish buried below the frost line. The following winter was normal. 5 months, March thaw, April fishing. Nobody needed the cellars. But the cellars were there, filled and sealed and waiting. Insurance against the thing that was rare but not never, the thing that Ylva's mother had warned about, the thing that had come and gone and would come again someday. Within 5 years, every family on the Hardanger Fjord had a cellar. The technique spread up and down the coast, carried by traders and fishermen who had heard the story of the widow who buried 500 pounds of fish and saved a settlement. The cold smoke frames appeared behind cowsheds and barns from Stavanger to Tromsø, and the birch bark containers became as common as salt barrels, and the invisible cellars multiplied beneath the fields until the earth itself was a storehouse, holding food that no one could see, and no one could steal, and no one could count except the women who had packed it there. The phrase Ylva's cellar entered the vocabulary of the Hardanger Fjord, meaning any preparation so well hidden that the people who would benefit from it did not know it existed until they needed it. When someone built quietly, stored secretly, prepared without display, people said she was building her cellar. And everyone knew what it meant, because everyone remembered the winter when the ice lasted 8 months and the only food came from underground. Thank you for watching this story about Ylva and the underground cellar. If it reminded you of the importance of invisible preparation and the value of the knowledge your mother taught you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Saga of Survival for more stories of quiet ingenuity and the people who trusted the process. Ylva Thorvaldsdottir lived until the age of 64, dying in the farmhouse that Torbjorn had built and that she had maintained for 26 years after his death. The cellar beneath the back field was still operational, still filled each September with cold smoked fish in birch bark containers, still holding the constant 42 degrees that preserved everything placed inside it. Her eldest daughter, Runa, took over the farm, the cellar, and the summer teaching sessions that Ylva had held for 2 decades. The shelves still held food that lasted through every winter without losing a single pound to rot, because the earth below the frost line does not change, and does not fail, and does not care about the storms that rage above it. They buried her beside Torbjorn, near the fjord, in a spot where the fishing boats launched at dawn and the nets dried in the afternoon sun. Her gravestone said only what she had asked it to say. She dug deep, nothing was wasted. What is the shelter that everyone thinks you do not have? And where have you buried your preparation?